are crimes every day across the globe.
911, what's your emergency?
Murders, homicides, burglaries, robberies, assaults, and so much more. Here, we will be telling you the true stories about those involved in homicides, murders, burglaries, robberies, heists, and many more crimes. So sit back, try to relax, and let's get into the show. This is Chilling Ice Cold Crime. Hello and happy Friday. It's October 6th and welcome back to the Chilling Ice Cold Crime podcast. I'm your host, Austin. If you would feel inclined, please check out our Twitter. This is your reminder, or X. I prefer Twitter. Our username is Ice Cold Crime Pod, so make sure you check us out over there for information on upcoming episodes and so much more. You'll see different tweets like new episode in the making coming today, which I just tweeted. You'll see things like just replies like this girl Kale said, cream cheese is meant to be ice cream scooped onto my bagel. None of this thinly spread crap. And I shared, amen. Maybe enjoy while listening to one of our episodes. Cream cheese bagels for the win. And of course, we got our GIF because of the freezer box murders. Anyway, with that being said, we're going to get into today's story, today's episode, and that is the story, which is a true crime story, the truck stop killer. So let's get reading. Now, a summary of this story. He was methodical, he rode the highways, and he preyed on teenage girls. Girls who'd run away, girls no one would miss. In the summer of 1985, the author of this story, Vanessa Veselka, was such a girl. One night on I-95, she hitched a ride from a stranger and endured the most terrifying moments of her life. Now, years later, she returns to the scenes of her fugitive youth looking for clues to the terror and the girls who lost their lives to it. This story was written October 24th, 2012. In the summer of 1985, somewhere near Martinsburg, Pennsylvania, the body of a young woman was pulled from a truck stop dumpster. I had just hitched a ride and was sitting in a nearby truck waiting for the driver to pay for gas so we could leave. When they found her, there was shouting. A man from the restaurant ran out and started yelling for everyone to stay away as a small crowd gathered around the dumpster in the rain. Word filtered back that the dead girl was a teenage hitchhiker. I remember thinking it could be me, since I was also a teenage hitchhiker. Watching this driver of my truck walk back across the wet asphalt, a second thought arose. It could be him. He could be the killer. The driver reached the cab, swung up behind the wheel, and said we should get going. He said he didn't want to get caught up in anything time-consuming. Stowing his paperwork, he released the brake. Neither of us said anything about the dead girl. As we pulled away, I looked once more in the side mirror. They were stringing crime tape around the dumpster just as another state trooper rolled into the lot. That ride turned out to be fine. We drove up to Ohio drinking Diet Coke and listening to Bruce Springsteen. The trucker brought me lunch and didn't even try to have sex with me, which made him a prince in my world. Several days later, though, heading south on I-95 through the Carolinas, I got picked up by another trucker who was not fine. I don't remember much about him except that he was a taller and leaner than most truck drivers, and didn't wear jeans or t-shirts. He wore a cotton button-down with the sleeves rolled neatly up over his biceps and had the cleanest cab I had ever saw. He must have seemed okay, or I wouldn't have gotten in the truck with him. Once out in the road, though, he changed. He stopped responding to my questions, his bearing shifted, he grew taller in his seat, and his face muscles relaxed into something both arrogant and blank. Then he started talking about the dead girl in the dumpster and asked me if I'd ever heard of the Laughing Death Society. We laugh at death, he told me. A few minutes later, he pulled the truck onto the shoulder of the road by some woods, took out a hunting knife, and told me to get in the back of the cab. I began talking, saying the same things over and over. I said I knew he didn't want to do it. I said it was his choice. I said he could do it in a few minutes. I said it was his choice. I said I wouldn't go to the cops, nothing happened to me, but it was his choice, until he looked at me and I went still. There was going to be no more talking. I knew in my body that it was over. Then he said one word: run. Without looking back, I ran into the woods and hid. I stayed there until I saw the truck pull onto the interstate. It was getting dark. I was still in shock. So I walked back out to the same road and started hitching south. I never went to the police and didn't tell anyone for years. This spring, a friend sent a news story link about a serial killer with the subject line, "Is this your guy?" The serial killer's name was Robert Ben Rhodes. Rhodes was a long-haul trucker in jail since 1990 who had recently been convicted of a couple of new cold cases. I didn't recognize him from the initial photos, but as I found pictures of him as a younger man, his face came to seem more familiar. The glasses were the same, the curve of the cheekbone, and something about the expression, particularly the set of the mouth. It had the same neutral arrogance. Rhodes looked like the guy who picked me up, but then Rhodes looked like a lot of guys. He could have been 39 at the same time. And I remember the trucker as an older man with light brown or graying hair. To a teenager, though, someone pushing 40 is pretty old, and hair often looks darker in photos. The light in my memory is strange, too. It was a cloudy day just before a summer storm, and everything in the truck cast in gray. Refreshing. After receiving my friend's email, I left messages with the FBI, but was relieved when they were not returned. The memory was 27 years old, and nothing in it was actionable. The photos stayed in my head, though, and with them came questions. What if the man who pulled the knife on me really did murder the hitchhiker? Why did he let me go? Who was the girl in the dumpster? Why didn't I go to anyone? I needed to understand what my responsibility was and to find my own answers if nobody else, so I began to look. I have no fascination with serial killers, so I didn't realize that Rhodes was famous. There are articles, TV episodes, and books on him. Driven to Kill, Roadside Prey, Killer on the Road. And from these sources, I learned that every grim and secret fear I have about the human race is manifest in Robert Ben Rhodes. Rhodes was a sexual sadist. He kidnapped women, tortured, and raped them for weeks before killing them. What is known about him in the 1980s is murky. He was involved in the BDSM and swinger scene in the hometown of Houston. He was married. When he was caught, he said that he had been doing this for 15 years, which would put the onset of his murders back in the 1970s. His trucking logs placed him at the area of 50 unsolved murders in the 3 years prior to his arrest alone. Well, not all 50 cases have been tied to Rhodes yet, and Rhodes himself has admitted to only 3 murders. The FBI has strong reason to believe that at his peak, he was killing 1 to 3 women a month. Rhodes was first arrested when an Arizona state trooper found a screaming woman named Lisa Pennell chained in the back of his cab. He was charged with kidnapping and assault. What put him away for life, though, was the rape and murder of Regina Walters, a 14-year-old girl from Pasadena, Texas. Rhodes picked her up along with her boyfriend, Ricky Jones, in February of 1990. Jones was promptly killed, and his remains were discovered later in Mississippi. Rhodes kept Regina for at least 2 weeks. He shaved her head and pubic hair, pierced her with fishing hooks, dressed her up in a black dress and heels, and photographed her in the moments of terror, then killed her with a garrote made of bawling wire, leaving her 100-pound body to decompose in a barn in Illinois off Interstate 70. Behind the tragic elements of Regina's story, like some kind of pentimento, I saw my own. Like me, she left home with her older boyfriend. Also like me, Regina became dependent upon the grace of truck drivers. In her weeks with Rhodes, many drivers saw her, but somehow no alarm was raised. She passed through that world as if she were invisible. In 1985, my biggest problem was sleep. There was no safe way for me to get it. I left home in early January, hitchhiking south from New York City with my 21-year-old boyfriend. We had $60 and a Smith & Wesson 5-shot with 1 bullet in it, which we accidentally fired off in a field in Maryland during a discussion about whether the safety was on. I had a guitar and a knapsack full of souvenirs from my girlhood, notes with friends, earrings, and song lyrics. I was 15. People don't leave home because things are going well. They leave because they feel they have to go. And right or wrong, that's how I felt. I lived with my mom in New York, and the fights between us were growing in intensely and emotional violence. I don't think either of us knew what to do about it. There was talk of me going to live with my dad in Virginia, where I had traditionally spent my summers. By then, though, I had been kicked out of 2 schools for absences and was cutting myself regularly. My emotions were a planet in which I spun like a moon. As I saw it, it didn't matter if I left because in so many ways I was already gone. On my way out, I destroyed every single picture of me over the age of 12 so that there would be nothing to give to the police. That first night, my boyfriend and I stayed in an abandoned barn in Maryland. It was off the side of the freeway and probably very much like the one Regina Walters was found in. The barn had a loft with wind coming through the broken slats and was surrounded by the same kind of brown grassy field and frozen mud. Like Regina, I had also had a little journal and probably wrote something in it that night because it was far too cold to sleep. We were back on the road before dawn, walking down a highway covered in black ice, shivering in our hoodies. A trucker picked us up at daybreak, and I rode in a semi for the first time. Being up high, warm, and looking out over the traffic was a great improvement. The trucker brought us chicken fried steak, chatted ambly, and let us nap in the cab while he drove. While we were asleep, he pulled into a small truck stop, and I woke to his hand down my shirt. I kept my eyes closed, stayed still, then rolled away from him, pretending I was still asleep. A few minutes later, I got up like nothing had happened. The trucker went to pay for gas, and my boyfriend and I went to use the bathroom. When we came back, the truck was gone, and a reminder of home with it. My guitar, my knapsack, everything except the Smith & Wesson, which we sold later in New Orleans. That first ride was a preview of how it would often go for me with truckers dodging sex and getting stranded. But I had learned one crucial lesson. When a truck slows down, you get up. Getting sleep was pretty easy with a boyfriend because one of us could always stay awake. 6 weeks later, though, we parted ways. Somewhere in Arizona, we had a fight in a gas station off of I-10, and we each climbed into separate trucks, and that was it. I was on my own. Without fake ID, I couldn't stay in a shelter. Sleeping by myself on the street made me a target, and having sex with some creepy old guy for a spot on a mattress also held little appeal. So I went back to hitchhiking in circles and discovered a state of half-consciousness wherein I could be asleep and not asleep at the same time. I could rest but not dream. I could tell you the last 3 songs played on the radio if you asked, but only if you asked. If you didn't, I had no memory of them at all. I stuck to trucks because they were safer than cars. When you get in a truck at a truck stop, everyone notices. They chatter about it on the CB, and you are driving off in what amounts to a huge billboard advertising the name of the company. I needed visibility to stay alive, but it was also a dangerous form of brinksmanship, because if a trucker was going to cross the line, the higher stakes meant he wasn't going to do it for real. There was a gap before that line, and most truckers wouldn't take it that far. I lived in that gap. Through these stories, though, I jumped from truck to truck. Like a lemur in a canopy of trees, I barely saw the ground. Even so, it still wasn't safe to sleep. Adhering to my rule that the only safe truck was a moving truck meant I woke when a truck took an exit. I woke when it slowed for traffic, when it turned, when it downshifted, when it drifted toward the shoulder. I woke. Wearing down from lack of sleep and trying to get a handle on my risk level, I began to work off a 1 to 5 scale of sexually aggressive behavior. 1. You, the driver, kept your urges to yourself. 2. You asked me to have sex and offered to pay. 3. You told me I owed you for sex for the ride and chicken fried steak and threatened to drop me off somewhere dangerous. 4. You dropped me off somewhere dangerous. 5. I had to jump when you slowed down because you were going to rape me. Most truckers occupied the middle of the scale, but the trucker who resembled Rhodes didn't have a place on it. Anybody who pulls a knife on you in an enclosed space like a truck is terrifying. But beyond that, it was the man's demeanor that was so chilling. He wasn't nervous, angry, or excited. He was grave and methodical, as if preparing to dress a deer. From reading about Rhodes and other things, I thought it had to be him. A friend said, how many of those guys could there be? Now, according to the FBI, quite a few. In 2009, the feds went public with a program called the Highway Serial Killings Initiative in response to a rising number of dead bodies found along the interstates. Some of these women were left in dumpsters, narrowing the field of those last seen about truck stops and rest areas. The Bureau counted over 500 bodies, almost all women. Of the 200 people on a suspect list, almost all of them were long-haul truckers. But nobody had to tell me that people like Rhodes killed people like me and got away with it. I'd heard of at least one who got hung up on a meat hook in the back of a refrigerated trailer because a trucker thought she'd given him VD. At night, I listened to the voices of prostitutes on the CB, barely intelligible, between screams of name-calling. Hello, honey, it's me, Sugar Bear, in Party Row. Anyone want a party? Lot lizards is what truckers call prostitutes who work truck stops. And since many drivers don't distinguish between hitchhikers and prostitutes, I was a lot lizard, too. If we went missing, months could pass before a report was filed, and by then there was little to connect the missing person in one state with the decomposed remains in another. When the Illinois state trooper who was trying to identify the body of Regina Walters, the girl Rose within the barn, put her forensic description out in the national teletype, he was totally unprepared for the response. He requested information on missing Caucasian males aged 13 to 15 years old who had disappeared 6 to 9 months earlier. He got over 900 matches. Continuing through this life, I flew to Austin to meet with 2 retired FBI men, Special Agents Mark Young and Robert F. Lee, who both worked on the case. Young was a profiler for the Bureau as well as a field agent. Over lunch at a local sushi place, he taught me the difference between a mode of operation and a signature. Modes of operation change. They're more like habits, he said, and can adapt to circumstances or mood. Rhodes, for instance, use guns and ligature strangulation, and probably knives too. A signature, however, does not change. Sexual sadists in particular work off erotic maps established early on. They get more nuanced and elaborate, but the basic topography remains the same. One of Rhodes' signatures was shaving the head and pubic hair of his female victims. Piercings around the breasts, bruising, and other signs of torture were also frequently found. Young, a 6-foot Texan and third-generation lawman, opened his laptop and pulled up a picture of a woman named Shanna Holtz. Only days before Regina Walters was taken, Rhodes had been detained by the police in Houston for the possible sexual assault and kidnapping of Holtz. She'd been picked up in a truck stop, shackled in the back of a cab, tortured and raped for weeks. She'd escaped when Rhodes pulled off into a Houston brewery. I'd always read that she got away because Rhodes forgot to chain her in, but I found out from Young that she had not been shackled when she escaped. Rhodes told her to sit there and be a good girl. But Holtz, 18 years old, had been on the street since she was 12. By her own account, she had been raped at least 20 times and had already had a baby. She knew how to survive. Whatever that man thought he had broken in her had already been broken and healed back stronger. She didn't do what he expected. She ran. She brought the police right back to Rhodes' truck, but then balked at pressing charges, so they had to let him go. The story was that she was too scared, but I wondered if there was more. I looked at the picture of Young's computer. Shauna was a pretty girl with freckles and blank blue eyes. Her thick red blonde hair had been cropped close to her head with a knife or scissors and was now growing back. With all her freckles, she looked very Irish. Around her neck was a dog chain with a padlock attached to the ring that had been used to restrain her neck. But in the picture with her inch-long hair and dog collar, she looked like a gutter punk, like any girl you might see in any university district. Young then showed me some pictures of Rhodes in the 1980s that had come from his wife. In one, he relaxed on the grass in a park. The natural light brought his hair closer to the color I remembered. And again, the side view heightened the key similarities: his cheekbone shape, glasses, the expression. But as I had learned from the echo chamber of Martinsburg, memory is a strange territory. By now, papers and photographs were spread out all over the table, and Young was waiting for me to tell my story. Although I told it more in the preceding week in the past 2 decades, I still wasn't used to doing it, and the nausea still came. One thing I always did, I told Young, was rifle through a trucker's cassette case as soon as we were out in the highway. This gave me a screen behind which to observe drivers when they thought I was distracted. It allowed me to pretend not to hear scary red flag comments so I would act dumb and get away later. And this is what I was doing that day. Going through a tape case, chatting like an idiot and watching the driver, which is why I saw him change. I told Young about the Laughing Death Society. He never heard the phrase. I asked about the knife. Every trucker I ever met had a gun, so the knife seemed significant. He said a gun was about control, but a knife is personal. I had seen the page from Regina's little notebook on which Rhodes had drawn a picture of a gun and a huge dagger dripping blood next to the words, "Ricky is a dead man." So the trucker I met, a true psychopath, I asked. What I found interesting is that he told you about the body of the girl and talked about the Laughing Dead Society while he was still driving. You were not under his control. This tells me that he liked manipulating through terror, that it turned him on, just like Rhodes. But a real serial killer wouldn't have let me go, right? I asked. Maybe he didn't think you'd run. Even at the time, I'd wondered if my running was part of the game. Rhodes was a great lover of games. His favorite book was Games People Play, wherein each social encounter is treated as a transaction or game. One game in the book is called Courtroom, another is called Beat Me Daddy, another Frigid Woman. In that one, driven by penis envy, a woman inner child taunts a man into seducing her so that she can free from the guilt of her own sadistic fantasies. Games People Play was a Bible for Rhodes. He talked about it frequently and applied its ideas. In a letter to his wife on the subject of psychological games, he wrote, "I always told you that you were 3 things before that." He wrote, "I always told you there were 3 things you could do: play, pass, or run." The phrase play, pass, run is used twice in the letter. Reading it, I found it hard not to hear the man telling me to run. The more I learned about Rhodes, the more I saw parallels between us. While I was hitchhiking, he was driving, and while I was getting more adept at survival, he was getting more adept at killing. Now, on the table in front of Young was a snapshot of Regina Walters that I hadn't seen, taken not very long before she was abducted. In it, she's sitting in the backseat of a car. The sun is coming down on her long hair, and she's laughing. She looks like any other skinny kid just out of middle school. She looks happy. The picture was given to Young by Regina's mom. Initially, agents had disagreed over whether the young girl on Rhodes' film was Regina. It was Agent Young who recognized a small gap in Regina's teeth and noticed that a few freckles were in the same place. Now, Young pulled out one last picture and slid it across to me. The photo was of a young, beautiful girl, possibly Native American. She was on the end of the roll with Regina. He said she's shrown sitting in Rhodes' truck wearing a gray hoodie. Her eyes are partly closed and she's stoned or sleepy. Rhodes must have just picked her up because he hasn't cut her hair yet. It is glossy black and long. No one knows who she is. On the phone, Agent Robert F. Lee was civil and to the point, but did not overly warm. I arrived at his door melting in the 100-degree heat. He welcomed me into his spacious living room. Tall and square-jawed, Lee looked like he could possibly still tackle a bank robber. Behind him was a shoulder-high pink plastic castle. "Granddaughter," he said. On the couch beside me was a large pillow with the FBI seal. "That's from my old SWAT jacket," he grinned. "They don't use that emblem now. Looks too much like a target." The question of what you do with your old SWAT jacket when you retire had never entered my mind. Clearly the answer is make a throw pillow. I got the sense Lee appreciated brevity, so I dispensed with small talk and went straight to my questions, but he stopped me. "I just want you to know," he said, looked me squarely in the eye, "that what Rose did to women, he did to women. You didn't do it." Everything I accepted from Bob Lee changed in that moment. I had not told him or anyone else how I felt about failing to go to the cops. These are my private feelings. The idea that I might have been felt responsible for what I did to girls like Regina was devastating, and Lee's directness startled me. And it was a wrong moment. So I told him the truth, which I had not told others, that I didn't say anything because I didn't think anyone would believe me. Well, said Lee, steering back after I finished, you're probably right. Look at Lisa Pennell. Now, Pennell was the woman chained into Rhodes' truck when they arrested him in Arizona. Continuing through all the different girls that he had raped, she spent a week on the road in Appalachia, visiting truck stops, interviewing the older truckers and waitresses. At first, I would ask about the girl in the dumpster, but no one had heard of her. So I asked if there was ever been a woman found in truck stops. Wherever I went, I was told nothing like that ever happened, which was remarkable given the numbers of bodies the FBI had tracked over the past 30 years. The newspapers were equally silent. It seemed our profound fascination with serial killers is matched by an equally profound lack of interest in their victims. Now, one library archivist explained that I was looking for the kind of news nobody wanted to read. The girl, he said, wasn't one of our own. She was a drifter. I've never heard of the word drifter used in earnest. It touched a nerve I didn't know I had. I had been a drifter. If what he said was true, the trail I was on had disappeared into a field. Out of desperation, I made one last attempt and swung by a smaller truck stop in Hancock, Maryland. I spoke to a woman who had worked there a long time and told her about the dead hitchhiker while she fingered the gold cross on her neck and listened. Has she ever heard about it? I asked. She shook her head. Then her eyes clouded some. Wait a minute. There was that one girl. She was a prostitute. They found her near a dumpster behind the restaurant at the Gateway Trail Plaza in Breezewood. She had a stocking down her throat, I think. That was way back in the early 70s, though. It wasn't the early 70s, it was 1987, and the woman killed was 19-year-old LaMonica Cole. I found her in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette later that night. She had been strangled at Breezewood. Another prostitute had been grabbed there as well in 2006, but was found farther down the road with her throat slit. Neither of these women were the one I was looking for, but a sentence in the article caught my attention. It said there had been a string of prostitute murders and truck stops in the area beginning in June of 1985, which was right on the edge of my time frame. The next morning, I drove to the Gateway Trail Plaza in Breezewood, Pennsylvania. I thought that maybe in a truck stop where no murders had occurred, people would be more forthcoming. Maybe they would remember something that others hadn't. So I parked in the front of the building, then walked back past a sign that read Trucks Only. The store for professional drivers was clean and quiet. I asked around until I found someone who had been there in 1985. It was a woman, probably in her mid-50s. She came over and gave me an open smile. I asked the same question I was asking everybody. Did you ever hear about a hitchhiker in a dumpster? No, she said. Did you ever hear anything like that at all in other times, any other bodies of women found along this stretch of I-70? That was in the one place where I knew for certain women had been found, one less than 100 yards away from where she was standing. No, she said, I never heard of anything like that. I remember being in the woods off I-95. I only ran about 100 yards before I turned and hid because I didn't know if I was being chased. I crouched on netted twigs and breathed into my shirt to muffle the sound. Listening to her, it occurred to me in this investigation of mine wasn't a detective novel. It was a ghost story. The prisons of Regina Walters, Shayna Holtz, and Lisa Pennell refracted into a set of icons. One in the backseat of a car laughing as she leans on the headrest. One with a shorn red gold hair, with an expression of resilience. One suddenly crazy and ready to fight, each casting their own light. Each a hologram of girlhood. Recently, the New Jersey State Supreme Court handed down a statement on memory describing it as a complex and often unreliable. The ruling went on to question the admissibility of eyewitnesses' testimonies. Moving forward a few more months, one snowy night several months later, I was hitchhiking through Amherst, Massachusetts, and a careful of students from Hampshire College picked me up and let me stay with them. In the morning, they talked me into applying to college. I was accepted, and that provided a thin strip of pride on which I stand while I made contact with my family. My mother was happy to pay for school. Being 16 and in college is an easier thing to think about. It was a solution that worked for both of us and looked like a redemption but didn't last. The distance between my emotional world and the one around me was still too great, and soon I left again. But in a more sanctioned way. I hitchhiked in Europe and settled in Vienna for a few years. I lived among artists in the Lower East Side squats. There are narratives we know. Unlike those of other young women on the road, my story was now recognizable. When I got home from West Virginia, a letter from Rose was waiting. It said he would see me if I promised never to say that I had seen him or what had passed between us. It was just the kind of promise a sexual predator or child molester would try to extract. He also wanted $500. I wrote him back and told him that journalistic standards wouldn't allow me to pay for interviews, but I expected that to be the end of it. But I got another letter. Young was right. Rose liked to think of himself as an expert, and now Rose suggested he be paid as one. But an expert in what, I thought? Killing? At the bottom of the yellow legal paper, scrawled in all caps, he wrote, "It wasn't me." I looked at the letter. He may be right, but certainly not because he's innocent. I imagine for a moment flying to Illinois, but certainly not because... I imagine for a moment flying to Illinois. I go through the paperwork, get fingerprint, and led through a channel of airlock doors into a room with him. He's there with his neatly pressed shirt and colossal arrogance. We do the interview, but I don't take notes. It doesn't matter what he says, after all. It's just going to be his word against mine. And who's going to believe him? That's where my fantasy ends, in a game of who is credible now. The same week that I got the letter from Rhodes, a senior officer from the Berkeley County Sheriff's Department who had been fishing returned. He said that no girls had ever been found in a dumpster in the Martinsburg, West Virginia truck stop, and I had no reason not to believe him. One story Deborah Davis told still haunts me. She was on a trip with her husband, Bob, the last she ever took in his truck. They were heading west on I-10 and stopped somewhere in Arizona at a busy truck stop. By the restaurant door was a young woman with a baby trying to get a ride. Deborah said she looked about 18 or 19 and desperate. Deborah wanted to give her money or do something. Her own sister had been on the street, and she was overwhelmed by the woman at the door and didn't want to just walk away. Rhodes saw what Deborah was looking at. He came around behind her and grabbed her shoulders. He turned her slowly towards the girl and pointed, "You see that, Debbie?" He whispered in her ear, "She's one of the invisible people." Wow. So nobody 100% really knows. So some of the murders were just lies, and some were known, and some are just never figured out. We don't really even 100% know if he was the killer, but that's, we have evidence. Very weird. Today, Rhodes is a prisoner of Illinois Department of Corrections. Interesting. Well, guys, that was one story, and that wasn't even all of it. There was a lot more details that I kind of overskipped because some were just things that weren't really that important. But if you guys do want to read the full story from today's episode, go over to my Twitter account, which is Ice Cold Pod, and you can check that out today. Ice Cold Crime Pod, Ice Cold Crime Pod is the username, and you can check out my tweet, which has the link to go read the entire story if you would like to get more details on the story. And with that being said, that looks like it is it for today's episode. So I want to thank you all for tuning in on this fantastic Friday. Have a fantastic rest of your day. Have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you all in our next episode. Crimes are committed every day all across the globe. This was just a few of them. There is millions and trillions more all across the globe. The real question is, will you return for the next episode to hear more of chilling ice-cold crime? I'm your host, Austin, and there is new episodes coming every week, sometimes more than once a week, so you can get more stories and more crime to wring your ears off. Ice cold stories of pure, true crime. Only here at Chilling Ice Cold Crime.